Thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. I should have asked if everyone can see my screen, but I'm going to guess because I haven't been interrupted that we are in good shape to go. So the purpose of today's meeting is to really dive into what syndicated audiences are. And what you'll learn at the end is that a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I think there's a lot of complexity around the topic of syndicated audiences, but at the core, it's a very simple concept of being able to identify your audience, personalize and engage with, because the ultimate goal is to have efficiencies whenever you are looking to acquire new business or keep existing business. And a big part of that is using data-driven strategy to do so. So what we'll cover today and why this matters, to put it bluntly, is that there is a lot of data out there, and it has a lot of varying purposes. So being able to really understand what those purposes can be, definitions, is really what we're setting out to do today. I was looking for advice on how to keep this interesting, besides my stellar voice, and one of the pieces of advice was to keep it conversational. As I think through what that sounds like, it's really me talking to myself, which, if you know me pretty well, I'm pretty good at doing, but at the same time would love it if we could make it as interactive as possible. Early slides will really just be covering kind of the basics, but if there are general questions or even specific questions that we need to dive into, I will stop intermittently and have a discussion around that. But without further ado, why this matters. There really is a ton of data out there. I checked just this week on one of the most prominent data marketplaces and found that there are 250,000 unique segments available for off-the-shelf purchase. What that means is if you're looking for dentists, you probably have options. There are dozens of segments targeted with dentists as the focus. So that is helpful, and that can be tested, but what I've found is that there are actually probably multitudes more of custom segments that are not available off the shelf. So that's the question: how many were built just for your campaign? We are going to discuss both syndicated audiences, which are those general off-the-shelf audiences, as well as custom segments, and when might be the best time to use one versus the other. So we did cover personalization. A big part of optimizing spend is making sure that your message is reaching the correct person. So to determine the correct person, there are a few ways to go at it. Some people have a really good sense for who their customer is. Others might need to apply models or do some testing, A/B testing, versus against who tends to be the customers, and then let the data and performance decide which segment makes the most sense. Two kind of eye-popping stats are that 87% of sales happen after 7 or more interactions. So while we think that we're paying for one interaction with a relevant audience, really what we need to do is be sure that we have the correct audience, because we're going to need to talk to them several times. Secondly, and why the audience selection does matter versus taking that general population sample, 100 records, is that whenever someone feels like the message is personalized, you're going to get much higher engagement. There are times that engagement can happen for the wrong reasons, but that's a story for another time. The personalization is something that we look to do and look to achieve at the audience cluster level, because that does allow us to deliver personalized messages without being over personalized and getting into that creepy factor. That's kind of what I was alluding to when I said sometimes personalization goes wrong. What we're attempting to achieve with syndicated audiences or off-the-shelf segments or general digital audience targeting is to really hone in on the relevant audience without excluding anyone who would be part of that. So it's kind of that balance between precision and recall, which I believe we'll define a slide or two later. One thing that we will also touch on today is cookieless options that are emerging. For the longest time, digital was thought to be cookie-based targeting or retargeting pixels. So there has been quite an evolution since that time, and we will continue to evolve as new identifiers and new channels emerge. So I have said syndicated quite a bit. I'll use that interchangeably with some of the other quoted words. Standard segments, always on, off the shelf. These are segments that are basic, but they're basic by design, meaning everyone is using these segments for targeting most of the time. The most often used segments are those core demographics, being age or gender, or if you're working in the B2B space, it's going to be decision makers or based on level within the organization. So this is that 250,000 and growing number that I mentioned. These are off-the-shelf segments, and they do really have a lot of use in the digital targeting space. The other variety of audience types that we'll talk about today are custom audiences. Sometimes these are referred to as first-party audiences or proprietary audiences. Good examples of those would be segments with custom in the name. Somebody is looking for individuals who visit McDonald's as their preferred restaurant of choice. Other one would be very specific. That would be really the key difference between off-the-shelf and custom segments, is the specificity between the segments that you're creating and what you're looking to accomplish. So as you can see, another actual example, people going through life stages and life events like moving and first-time home buyers. That would be something that isn't always available off the shelf, especially with that first part, the optimized for CTV. So a lot of layers to that segment to unpack, but most of the time you will be able to get to the bottom of what that segment is. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll know the questions to ask to get there. More key terms. I promise I won't term us to death. I think this is the last one, but it is important to understand really the refresh cadence between segments and what that means. So let's take the new mover example. This is something that when a user is looking, say we're working with a furniture store, and they know that the purchasing decision for furniture is most oftentimes made within 90 days of moving to a new home. So being able to identify new movers is very important to them, especially within that 90-day time window. So what they would be looking for is a full refresh, where every time a new data set comes through, it has a 90-day look back window on it, and only a 90-day look back window. By comparison, an incremental update segment is something where the audience segment continues to grow over time. So contrasting a visitor to a new Nike store, shouldn't use the brand, but whenever brands are building their CRM data or their acquisition data set, a lot of times what they're looking to do is build that database from day one and continue to build it over time and be able to market to those, so measurement can occur. And in those cases, whenever you're looking for visitors, you do want to use incremental segments, but still have the ability to define the time since the last visit within that incremental segment. So you can build really large segments with incremental audiences, whereas with full refresh, new message goes to a new audience each time the data is refreshed. Finally, probabilistic versus deterministic. Deterministic, the best way I can define that is what you see is what you get. The data is sourced in a very clear and easily understood way, and this segment should reflect that. So if you see something, say a transactional segment where somebody purchased a new sweater, that is from transactional data, a point of sale system collected it, and there is name, postal information. Again, digital audiences are not at the individual level, they are clusters of individual. That way they are privacy compliant and safe for audience targeting, but the deterministic element happens at the individual level and is aggregated to a larger group. Whereas probabilistic is more of a modeled segment, typically has some representative sample that the model is applied against. So a good example of that would be, say, Spanish television programming, streaming service. They understand there's a certain demographic breakdown of who their viewers are. And based on that, they can apply their models to a larger population based on what they know about their current subscribers. So both probabilistic and deterministic are effective, but when to use them is really dependent on the use case. So before I go any further, are there any questions? Looking at the chat, looks like we're in pretty good shape. So now I'm just going to jump right into a couple examples of how the syndicated audiences come to be. So as you might imagine, this is a custom segment, and this is kind of the creative process that goes into building those. So say we're working with a major cosmetics brand, and their goal is to identify audiences that fall into one of three categories, either a luxury brand, independent, or drugstore. The reason that they know that these are the audiences that they want to target is they have specific products and specific creative around each of those verticals. So by working with a company like Stirista or another data provider in the digital audience space, they can define that audience and then build the audience for data-driven creative decisions. We call that competitive conquesting. They can also use it for complementary services. Sorry about my background noise. So complementary services might be, again, jumping to streaming services. I have that on the mind, but most streamers make the decision to begin streaming within 30 days of acquiring a streaming device like an Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV. So being able to understand when that transaction occurs is like gold for a streaming service, because that's whenever people are subscribing. So being able to build that audience and distribute it to the DSP, which is demand side platform that they are using, is a really effective way of syndicated audiences. So just another custom segment, but to stay with this major cosmetics brand, what they know is their competitors fall into one of these three categories. So we've got the drugstore category, the luxury category. What we allow for with syndicated audiences is a grouping of these deterministic, meaning followers where we know the public handle and have it associated with offline PII at the group level of competing brands. all of those followers get rolled into a single segment called 123 Push Consumer Social Media Followers Drug Store Makeup Brands. And you get a full description, data sourcing method, and information on exactly where that data is coming from. So this is very common for the industry to provide all of this information kind of beyond the black box. Typically, these types of segments are built working with either the brand or agency. But as I mentioned, this is how you go from kind of the concept to the actual segment. And then once that segment is created, it is distributed to the destination of choice. So I mentioned before the number of off-the-shelf segments. What you'll see here is just a screenshot from Popular Data Marketplace of all of those segments. So you see 424 different providers, 216,000 total segments, and quite a few business granular audiences. Hopefully you can see that. But whenever a buyer is searching for a digital audience or an off-the-shelf audience, it's typically done as a free text search. So when building segments, having a variety of segment descriptions to help the buyer find your segment is a nice rule of thumb. Good example of that would be if, for instance, you're looking to target newly engaged couples. Provider A, I don't think Fanatics is a big provider of newly engaged data, but just for the sake of example, say they include it as newly engaged, whereas Crosswalk provides it as brides-to-be, and 123 Push has it both ways. So whenever the user inputs brides-to-be, two of the providers will show up in the search. Whenever they type in newly engaged, Fanatics and 123 Push will show up. So having those varieties is a really good way to capture off-the-shelf usage and make sure that you're assisting the agency and the brand in reaching the audience that they want, if they know what they want and custom segment is not required. So this is a good example of just the variety of movers that make sense depending on what the goal of the campaign is. So you can see that look back window of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months for new movers. All of those are relevant and in use. When they are used really depends on client decisions. Again, you should be able to deterministically understand the segments. Sorry, it's misuse of deterministic. I just had it on my mind. But whenever you are selecting a segment, typically you are going to be able to get additional detail like the data sourcing, whether it's deterministic or probabilistic, who the provider is, and when the data was last refreshed versus incrementally refreshed. So just continuing on that example, there are a number of DSPs out there that have syndicated audiences, both custom and off the shelf available. This is one of the more popular DSPs out there. Again, very similar to the data marketplace that we explored before. There are a number of audience data providers. So we're not short of audiences that you can reach. But understanding which ones you want to reach and being able to really decipher where the data is coming from, how it's going to be used, how often it's refreshed. Those are really the big questions to ask and confirm prior to using it for your campaign. Again, continuing with the new mover example, there are several varieties of that, more than we can fit on the screen. but all of them are relevant and possibly of use for the campaign, depending on what the goal is of the campaign. Finally, strategy that's used by a lot of agencies and data buyers is to really use all of the movers or all of the segments and optimize towards the highest performing segment. So oftentimes you will have users of your audiences who will test out the data at the beginning of the campaign, and as it's performing, either positively or negatively, move funds toward the higher performing segments. So oftentimes this is a good way to really get connected with the buyer and the brand and determine if a custom segment might be an option that better fits their goals for the campaign versus what you have off the shelf or in your always on segment catalog. So again, we'll stop there before diving into the next section and see if there are any questions.
Hi, Blaine.
Hey, Ruth.
Hi. Are you going to be preparing a similar webinar explaining about B2B data by any chance?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Ruth. So these segments have really been geared toward consumer data or data about people at the individual household level. At the same time, business to business data is a big part of the syndicated audiences as well as custom audiences, and B2B marketers have really evolved and come a long way over the past 5 years in terms of the amount of data that they can connect to an online identifier like an IP address, mobile advertising ID, CTV, as well as cookie. So yeah, I think it's definitely worth discussing the B2B component of this and how certain B2B brands are reaching decision makers or reaching specific companies or departments that are using technology XYZ. All of that is very doable within the digital space and made possible by having data linked across both the personal and professional landscape.
Thanks. I think it deserves a whole webinar of its own, please.
All right, that sounds good. We'll make note of that.
Okay.
Yeah, so just a little bit more supporting evidence on why having relevant audiences is so important. There's quite a bit of ad waste. I've kind of alluded to some of the ways that can happen, given that there are such a large variety of segments out there and varieties of quality within that. There is $37 billion that goes to waste in ad spend every year. That's based on this marketing evolution research. With that said, the best performing data tends to have more advertising dollars put behind it, and to find that data, ads have to be available. So finding that balance between the amount of data that you test versus when you optimize is a decision that's made really based on how the data is performing. But there are independent third-party validation services out there. There's TruthSet here as one of those, but most people in the space are also familiar with digital ad ratings, which provided by Nielsen typically does focus on age and gender because those audiences are the ones that are most commonly used. Our most recent quarter working with TruthSet, who does have over a dozen different data providers. Our data was #1 performing in gender and #5 in age, but when combining those two, #3, which we're very proud of, and definitely understand why it is, because our data is mostly deterministically sourced, especially on the offline side, offline being data sets that originate really from deterministic sources. So you will see an email name and postal for the individual audience prior to it being clustered into, say, that age segment grouping of individuals age 30 to 34, or females age 40 to 49. But yeah, again, we'll pause just to make sure that everything's still tracking here. Are there any other questions? All right, continuing on. The reason I'm pausing for questions is I get a little uncomfortable bragging on Stirista, but I think this stuff is really worth talking about. Ruth, to your point, one of the big reasons why B2B has grown over the past few years is that companies like Stirista are getting a lot better at connecting the consumer profile to the business profile. So whenever I'm looking to target, say, that HR person who's interested in fitness because I have a great fitness program, I can now leverage a digital audience to do that. Whereas before, most people are doing their browsing and thus getting their online identifiers like cookies and mobile ads associated with the consumer profile only. But by connecting the business profile to the consumer profile, you can now target a business contact as if it were a consumer contact, and have far greater reach that way. To kind of play by that same token, CTV has been biggest emerging channel. I think we are beyond it emerging, and it has emerged and will continue to grow. But really understanding insights at the household level is the key to optimizing CTV devices, because a lot of that information and those devices are associated with multiple people within the household. So while it was something that lacked precision in the old days and was an area of pushback, now I think marketers are really open to the idea of understanding insights at the household level and being able to target accordingly. The custom example that we went through earlier really covers both the competitive conquesting angle as well as the complementary product upselling opportunities. That's something that new and interesting data sets emerge, definitely is an option, particularly for custom, just because of the large variety of brands out there who are looking to advertise, and each one has their own unique set of competitors. So that would be impossible to create an off-the-shelf audience that fits what those brands are attempting to accomplish. Finally, with some of the unique data sets, a limitation can be the reach. So say you have 100 best customers. That's great. Those are the ones that you really want to work with and continue to grow. But if you are looking to continue to expand, you're not going to get a whole lot of reach in the digital space by just using those 100 customers. So there are data providers out there like Stirista who can take that seed audience and, based on the demographics, key segments that really stand out against the general population index, can expand that list of, say, 1,000 best customers or target accounts to over 1 million, just by looking at how that list compares to the general population and then applying those selects as a new custom segment. The next few slides really outline a few examples of what the custom audience look like. This one is for the target audiences around mature beauty. That's something that brands have come to us to really understand who is most relevant, who is most likely to purchase, and also we want to advertise on CTV. So give us the individuals who have been optimized for CTV. So based on that, we can identify that audience and push to their platform of choice, whether it's a DSP, DMP, or anything that's connected to LiveRamp or able to receive data directly from the provider. Can also look to use data to expand an existing segment. So say the new movers audience is working really well, we can come to the data provider and look for options to expand that to say, what other life event triggers would work? Would people who are pre-movers or people who are first-time home buyers also be relevant? So you can use these audiences, which are off the shelf, for expanding your audience and expanding your reach. So just to wrap here, there are really no major platforms that Stirista and Stirista Fusion partners audience segments cannot be found. Said differently, you can find our segments everywhere. So we do have a number of distributions, each of them with their own unique sourcing stories. Some of them are Fusion partners, and the Fusion program, just to briefly touch on that, is a program that Stirista set up a few years ago to help data providers with really interesting data sets, as well as brands who have really interesting data assets, bring their audiences to the digital space. So where Stirista supports them is to build a taxonomy and distribute segments to the different platforms out there. And the benefit is that these data providers and brands can monetize their data and have it available in channels that it was not before. And Stirista will take the work that has work and corporate knowledge that we've learned over the past 10 years and really apply that to get the taxonomy built and distributed faster than the data providers would be able to themselves. So you can see the list here of those Fusion partners, as well as Stirista sub-brands that are available, but as I mentioned, have their own unique sourcing story and thus are kept separate just for ease of understanding and use. So again, we'll stop here and see if there are any questions.
Hey, Blaine, this is Patrick. I do have one question. So it goes back to one of the earlier slides. You said there's a lot of wasted ad spend. Do you tend to find that that occurs when companies are buying multiple, kind of combining to your points, multiple off the shelf, right, audiences where there could be existing records within each audience? Is that typically where it's happening? And if that happens to most brands, is it more beneficial to develop those custom audiences or work directly with the provider to do that?
It's a really good question, Patrick. I think that some waste is necessary, and in fact, I wouldn't categorize it as waste as much as paying to learn which segments should be optimized. And where the budget should go over time. So a typical strategy is to allocate, say, 10% of the media budget to testing different data sets, and then at the end of that test, pushing the segment that performs the best during the test period. Where the waste can occur is if that's the strategy at the beginning of the campaign and it never gets pushed to the highest performing segment. That's where you will see the waste come from. So it does require some active management of the campaigns, but that's something that it really comes down to the media buyer and who's working. So I think that's where the waste can come from. But I think the best way to avoid it is to really actively manage the campaign and actively seek to understand the data segments that are being used. So you understand the sourcing, whether it's deterministic or probabilistic, and just making sure that the way the data is set up and refreshed aligns with the goals of the campaign. Sometimes the goal of the campaign is just to deliver as many impressions as possible. And in those cases, you probably don't need to spend as much time really understanding the specific area where the data came from. But if I were looking to remedy what I consider to be waste on digital data, that would be really where I would focus, is really understanding the syndicated audiences that I'm using and optimizing toward the higher performing audiences.
Hey, Blaine, questions, since we're talking about like waste in that sense. So like if an advertiser is to be running multiple campaigns, is it possible or really common for audiences to be competing or working against each other in that sense that like they're too similar?
Yeah, so I think if you are introducing really high quality data sets into the campaign, say decision makers in San Antonio, just for the sake of example, there's a really good chance that the same decision makers are part of two of the competitive audiences. And so one has to win. So what most DSPs have built in, and I think that applies to any that I've ever worked with, is that whenever there is overlap between the segments, the DSP will not charge for both of those, but instead create one large combined segment so that the user is only charged once. So at that point, it really becomes who is supplying more of the higher performing data, because there is an understanding that if you are targeting to a limited audience and there is overlap, both of those are going to perform well to a certain extent on those that they overlap, but the difference will be the ones that don't overlap, who is right more often on the margins versus the overlap. All right, anything else? All right, well, be happy to send out this recording and presentation. And if there are any questions that come up, my email is b.britten@stirista.com. You can also reach the Stirista digital team by reaching out to digitaldata@stirista.com. And yeah, if any questions come up or custom audiences are needed, or just more information on the audiences that we have available today, please do send those along, and we'd be happy to take a look. Well, thank you all for your time today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.